All right, everyone, welcome to the 1-2 review video. I'll try to provide some brief interpretations and answers that might have come up in your own responses to the questions. Remember, for your questions, you didn't have to talk about all the poems. You just had to pick two, right, and go through and answer these questions. But I'll try to, instead of going through and doing this, I'll try to provide answers on each poem very, very briefly in a minute or two. So let's get started. So one thing we might say about God's grandeur is that it's clearly, linking beauty and nature and the existence of all things to having this sort of eternal energy that's always there and omnipresent. And I think that's a very modern view of nature. We see a bit of the fall in this, I suppose. Why do men not reck his rod? It kind of sounds a little bit like Adam and Eve, right? Ruining nature. Even though Adam and Eve, we know we're falling into original sin and those type of things. And seems more about ruining the grandeur of the environment. So it reads kind of like a modern environmental poem. But the thing we need to ask in this poem is, how does it talk about human behavior and its problem into the environment? It seems that we have a condemnation of the behavior here. It's fallen behavior, so to speak. But can nature recover? If we're giving an environmental reading of this poem, it seems that for all this, nature is never spent. That would be a problem to an ecologist, right? To an environmentalist, because if we're mistreating nature in some way, it doesn't just come back. We have some pretty major problems. We have an imbalance in nature. We're using up our resources too quickly. Nature becomes spent. Nature becomes degraded, right? Maybe in the 19th century, this felt true. It's kind of like the Industrial Revolution. We don't have a lot of modern problems quite yet when this was written. Hopkins might feel different today. But in this poem, this idea that because nature is created by God, it is never spent and will always replenish itself, we know is not true. So we could say this poem actually presents a problematic environmental message that is one that's based in religion and spirituality, that God's creations will recover regardless of what humans do to it. That's a very religious view, especially a Christian religious view, but it is not an ecological view, because as we know, we can spend nature and ruin nature very, very easily over the course of a century, the century since this poem was written, as it turns out. So that is one thing we could say about this. There's definitely some fall in there. The recovery seems to be through God, and that it's God's creation. It seems like there's maybe some stewardship going on in here. We should take better care of it. So you might have seen that in there as well. Doesn't seem like we're supposed to dominate it, right, everyone? So I think our basic course concepts we can see in here in this, however, goes off track by saying that humans aren't ultimately responsible. So it moves away from the stewardship narrative down in here. We don't have to be stewards. Why? Because nature bounces back, so to speak. All right, if we want to look at this poem here, which I think is a fascinating poem to put into an environmental course, it's about the problems of the big city, of course. What are some of the problems? We can just go through this quickly. Well, it's chartered. What does that mean? It means it's divided up and mapped and squared, right, and owned. So this is sort of against, you could say, charters showed that we owned property, right? So that meaning is in there. So the ownership of property, we could read into that, or at least that we divide things up into squares and it's not natural to do so. The chartered Tims does flow again. It's contained or owned or mapped in some way, which is not, nature, right? So humans are constantly controlling nature, and we get that right from the beginning here. And that seems to be part of the problem. And then we turn to people. After we get nature in the first two lines, we get people here and all of the horrible things that are going on. There's babies that are living in fear, mind-forged manacles. Well, all of these problems are of human creation, our need to control nature that we get up here. And we have the different types of, things that pass for nature in the city. The chimney sweepers cry. We have some salvation here, but the church itself is black because it's in the city. London was a very, very dirty city at this point in the Industrial Revolution already. We have soldiers who are at war with each other. So we're sort of living outside of our nature. Our human creations aren't working out very well. It's definitely a poem with, I would say, fall and not a lot of recovery necessarily. It seems like even the future, the marriage hurts, which will make babies, and here we have an infant here, are all problems and don't seem to have much of a positive future. Say about Negro Speaks of Rivers. Again, I pushed you toward looking at how culture and history are used to define. And remember, Adam got to name the animals and stuff. And we see something similar going on here. But here it feels more positive, like there's some spiritual sustenance in it. It's not about ownership and power and domination. This is someone going into nature to find, if not a connection with nature, at least a connection with the culture, the spiritual culture that will provide them some spiritual sustenance. And that is symbolized through the history of the rivers and the different places that are important in African American history, like New Orleans, right? The Mississippi River, and then going back farther, of course, to Africa itself, Congo and the Nile and these type of places. So we see nature here equated with some culturally and historically important places. So it seems like a recovery narrative. Life is certainly getting better here. But notice that it isn't a critique on our use of nature, but rather this poem shows how we use nature as, much like Adam and Eve, sort of a cultural representation or a cultural symbol, in this case of salvation or spiritual liberation or something like this. Next thing I might say about this poem before we move on is something to do with the stanzas, which we talked about in the preview video and have talked about a bit here as well. There's some repetition, but it's mainly the I that is the repetition. We don't really have a rhyme scheme, so to speak. What most people would say about this is it's written in something known as free verse. There's not a lot of repetition. And you have sort of these short bursts in between the groupings of three, right? And so inside of here, what you have is sort of a very sort of spoken thing that doesn't sound like a poem at all. In fact, you might have looked at it and said, this doesn't look like a poem. Poems are supposed to rhyme, right? And it's the idea that we're breaking out of poetry and we're breaking out of rhyme and those constraints, which is also liberating, right? So this poem is breaking down the barriers of what we see as poetry, or the expectations of sort of symmetric poetry, with lines and 2 lines or 4 lines or 6 lines. And this one is a lot more free and open, probably also symbolizing the breaking down of barriers in some way, and being liberated, spiritually liberated, which is what this poem is all about. All right, moving on to The War Against the Trees. What can we say about this poem? One thing that I pointed you to in the preview video is looking at all of these stanzas that are pretty much the same, and I think I'll talk about that as an entry point to this poem. It is indeed seeming to be a well-ordered world. So one way to read this is that inside of this well-ordered world where there seems to be lots of progress and everything is just like a daily scene, all these things coming in, the construction equipment tearing down the trees that were a century old. We're starting to, as we read through here, the bulldozers drunk on gasoline, we're really starting to see that there is, a problem here, that there is an attack on nature, and it seems to come from the bulldozers and the idea of progress. Right? Scientific progress, developmental progress, those types of things, just building suburbia, basically. And so what we might take away from the way that this meaning, which I think is pretty easy to take away from the poem, matches the way the poem is written, is that the world looks really well ordered, and we think of these things as fairly ordered and ordinary, and there's progress, and it's, again, nice and symmetric and easy to see, and that's what the poem is telling us. This all feels so even that we don't even think about it much, this idea of progress. There's a lot of assumptions that we have about the order of the world, just like this poem is ordered in this very particular way, very symmetric way. But there's a lot wrong with the order of the world too, and that's probably a good way to look at the way the style of this poem, or the stanzas of this poem, match the meaning. This is a poem asking us to question our assumptions about what is normal in the way that we treat the environment, that we're just going to knock down trees to build new things. Maybe we shouldn't be doing that. And we slowly start to see that, the crown's forcing the giants to their knees, right? So I know that you all read that and you got this poem. This is a pretty easy poem in that way. Definitely about a fall and a mistreatment of nature. Is there a recovery narrative? Well, the recovery probably isn't a good one. This seems to be implying that progress narrative that we talked about in submodule 1.1, that we just keep knocking down things down and building new things, and this is what humans are supposed to do. And that recovery narrative or progress narrative can force us to overlook some damage that we're doing as well, some problems. And lastly, how do we know this is a poem about questioning our assumptions about the order of things and how it seems natural and when it maybe isn't, and there are other ways of living? Well, people are just watching this in their rear view mirrors, right? It's barely something to even note. They're not even paying attention. It's not even their eyes that are seeing it. It's just reflected in the mirror, and this is a reflection of us and our society as well, right? So that's a really nice way, I think, to read this poem, that is asking us to question our sense of order, and therefore the poem itself looks very ordered. A fairly similar poem written at about the same time, Who Runs America by Ginsberg. If there's something that you notice that's different here, there's very particular things that are environmental here. The colored smoke and all these things. We don't see those, drunk bulldozers doing the damage. The interesting thing about this poem is it kind of shows us some effects, but it doesn't show the causes. It doesn't show the action. Instead, it's made a poem out of modern life and all these concepts and places where the oil comes from. And so it's sort of a shocking type of poetry. And we expect, a poem to look more like the last poem, The War Against the Trees. But instead, we're left with this as the modern poetry. And maybe that's what the poet is doing, is saying, is this what we get? Is this what the world is going to be made up out of? These things? That's kind of ugly. They're not poetic. And so by showing these things and putting in a poem, he's kind of shocking our awareness that, no, this is a pretty ugly world. This is, the economic world, the industrial world that we live in. And this is what it looks like when you put it into a poem. And it's a lot different than God's grandeur or something like that, right? Because the world has changed. And so that's a nice way to read this poem, other than I think what's obvious. It's a critique of power. It's a fallen world. It doesn't seem like there's a lot of recovery, even though this is considered progress as well, right? Certainly not a lot of stewardship going on here, just a lot of domination and power. And that's another way to read the poem. All right, let's talk about storm warnings. I really like this poem. It's probably the hardest to kind of suss meaning out of in some ways. It doesn't give us an easy answer, and many of the other poems do, I think. So I'll just walk you through this one, some things that I'm seeing. You may have seen different things, and you can kind of check out your own reading against mine. Let's break this down stanza by stanza. In the first stanza here, basically what we see is that noticing the weather, and she seems to be reading we could call it her inner consciousness, or she's projecting herself or something kind of into the weather, it seems. The gray unrest moving across the land. Well, the weather is out there and it seems to be doing that, but we're learning something, and this comes across more later. She seems very philosophical, almost maybe a bit bothered or highly reflective, and not necessarily in a positive or negative way, but she could move either way. We find out by the end. There's these troubled regions. So there seems to be a lot of trouble. Sort of the color gray is sort of the tone of the poem and colors the poem, so to speak. And so she's seeing the weather as sort of a projection of her inner self, or maybe of life in general, or a certain view of life that sees life as gray. Why might we see life as gray? That seems kind of like the fall narrative without maybe recovery or something like this. We can move on to the second stanza and maybe start to get some answers a little bit here. I really like the last two lines, the weather abroad and weather in the heart. So the outside is like the inside, right? The outside is the inside. They alike come on regardless of prediction. So easy way to think of this, life always happens regardless of your expectations or your prediction. You can't predict what's going to happen to you. And so this is a poem that's using the weather as a metaphor to kind of get at what should we do with this unpredictable life that's filled with, happiness and unhappiness, sometimes at the same time or at different times. What do we do with all of this? One thing the poem seems to be teaching us is that human creations don't matter much. The clocks, the weather glasses, they all become shattered fragments that aren't proof against the wind, right? Proof is an interesting word. She could have gone like shelter against the wind, but we're trying to prove that we're bigger than nature, and we can't seem to do it, right? Instead, we seem to be more like the weather. It seems, and life seems to be more like the weather, unpredictable. We don't know what's coming next. Gray sometimes, sunny others, whatever it might be. And gray in this poem, certainly. But so the third stanza is teaching us that human creations don't matter too much. We can only close the shutters against life. We can hide from life, but that's about it. It's still going on out there, right? Look for defenses against this problematic life filled with unhappiness. And these are the things we've learned to do to kind of hide away. We've got some ritual maybe going on with the candles and stuff like this, some religion. But But it's maybe we could interpret it that way, that this is all we can do against life. That's kind of a negative reading of the poem, kind of a downer, I suppose, but we could read it that way. The other way to look at this is that placing humans first, thinking we have to overcome life and nature and its problems in some way, probably isn't the best way to see life. We don't have to see ourselves as fallen. We don't have to see the world as imperfect. We can accept the world as it is and see it as positive as much as negative. Just about out of time in this video. I'm going to make one more short video of just a few minutes to take you through Silent Spring and the newspaper article. So please check out that video as well. Thanks.